Thank you so very much for this invitation. I'm honored for this opportunity to work with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. When I was introduced to this history as a member of the audience at a 1999 symposium at Drew University, I did not anticipate becoming a modern-day chronicler seeking to ensure this story continues to be told so that we never forget, and so that we teach our children that our own humanity is inextricably linked to affirming, ensuring, and embracing the full humanity of everyone. I'll take a moment now to share my screen as we begin. This presentation is based on Gabrielle Simon Edgcomb's research, which is archived at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and also at the Amistad Center at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. Edgcomb's book, From Swastika to Jim Crow, Refugee Scholars at Black Colleges, was published in 1993. Her book went on to be the scholarly foundation for the film of the same title by Martin Cheatle, Laurie Toub, and produced by Stephen Fischler and Joel Zucker in 2000. When Jewish refugee professors fled Germany and Austria for the United States, they confronted not only the Great Depression's high unemployment rate, so they're coming into the country at the very time, of course, when people are being laid off. But they're also confronting anti-Semitism and quotas that limited the number of Jewish students and Jewish faculty in America's white colleges and universities. At the same time, the doors of segregated, historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, were open to them. Those who received faculty appointments at HBCUs arrived to find themselves immersed in humanistic, optimistic spaces of Black hope and Black ambition. We'll begin with the critical foundation of the 1930s in three distinct places and contexts. First, Nazi Germany's expulsion of Jewish professors, America's own endemic and violent racism against Black people, and American anti-Semitism. With this foundation in place, we will look at the process of refugee professors coming to the United States and the specific placement of some of these professors at HBCUs. I will share with you a summary of the professional and personal lives of a few of these professors and their students, and some reflections on how this history fits into the larger landscape of Black-Jewish relations. And then I will conclude with a few ways the content and themes might be infused in primary and secondary school classrooms, and at that point very much invite your comments and suggestions. We begin with the broad context of violent racism in Nazi Germany and in the United States. As you see on the title slide, this section includes very disturbing photographs of actual lynching. So please close your eyes or turn your head away from your screen if you need to do so, or also be aware if there are any children in the room who should not see these graphic details. I will give you at the time a warning that that slide is about to be shown. On May 10th, 1933, the Nazi Germany student organization, having called for a literary purge of all works considered un-German, burned over 25,000 volumes in the 34 university cities you see shown on this map. Thousands gathered in public spaces with students, Nazi party officials, and police. In the fervor of these ritual cultural cleansings, student leaders swore an oath by the fire to combat un-German literature and continued to confiscate a growing number of works, 80 to 90,000 books. A little over a week after the book burnings, on Friday, May 19th, 1933, an article appeared in England's Manchester Guardian Weekly entitled "Nazi Purge of the Universities, a long list of dismissals," and provided, and I quote, "a detailed list of the professors who have been dismissed from their posts in German universities between April 13 and May 4. Most of the professors have been dismissed because of their Jewish origin, a few because of their liberal sentiments," end quote. The article lists 183 dismissals and 11 resignations of professors in every field, from law and sociology to chemistry, dentistry, mathematics, music, journalism, and engineering, from universities in Berlin, Bonn, Leipzig, Hanover, Frankfurt, and all over Germany. The next slide will depict one of those graphic pictures that I mentioned earlier. In the same year, 1933, over 4,000 miles away from Nazi book burnings and university expulsions, 24 Black people were lynched in what was by then a decades-old pattern of systemic racist vigilante violence against Black freedom that followed the Civil War, and centuries-old legacy of Black bodies being captured, bound, bought, and sold. Following the Civil War, the nation retreated from constitutional guarantees, rights, and privileges of Black citizenship, and instead anointed white supremacy as the highest law of the land. White supremacy defined people by race, but also by national origins and religion, so that Southern and Eastern Europeans, Catholics, and Jews were targeted as alien to white Protestant American ideals, culture, and identity. Another slide depicting a lynching comes up next. White supremacy cheered the murders of 6,500 Black men, women, and children between 1865 and 1950, like Laura Nelson and her son in Oklahoma in 1911. The murders could be as random as the shooting of a Black family who were on a picnic. White vigilantes targeted Black ambition by burning Black schools and businesses like the thriving Black Wall Street in Tulsa in 1921, and riots throughout the nation in 1919. Vigilantes attacked Black soldiers who were wearing their uniforms, seeing those uniforms as a badge of American citizenship, manhood, and courage that was denied to Black men. They targeted Black womanhood by raping Black women and girls, such as Mrs. Reese Taylor, with activist Rosa Parks organizing to protect Black women and to bring rapists to justice. Another lynching picture appears next. These murders and crimes were committed not only with impunity, but also with the open participation of law enforcement, police, sheriffs, and judges. Lynchings in particular were sometimes ritualized public murders that included cutting off body parts or burning a victim alive. People brought their children, posed for pictures, and took souvenirs. And what you see here is an actual postcard. By 1933, attacks on Black bodies still had not stirred Congress to pass an anti-lynching bill first introduced in 1918 and continually introduced in Congress, most recently in 2021, to reverse and redress this legacy of a nation where Black lives did not matter. The same European powers that bought and sold Africans also transported anti-Semitism to America as part of a rather broad canopy of racial constructions meant to define and categorize people as inferior or barely human at all, making indigenous people a race, making Jews a race, Africans a race, the Irish a race, the Chinese a race, just to name a few. All of these constructions were manifested differently, but they have at least one thing in common. They sought and still seek to justify one group's power to subordinate another group of people by devaluing their humanity around how they look, what they believe, what they eat, their national origins, the language they speak, where they live, and even the pronunciation and spelling of their names. American anti-Semitism was reaffirmed in the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915 as anti-Black, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, xenophobic, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant agenda at its core. American anti-Semitism was reaffirmed in 1921 and 1924 with immigration laws that restricted immigration except from Northern and Western Europeans by an American right wing that tried to blame the Depression or claimed that the Depression was a Jewish conspiracy. Anti-Semitism was affirmed again in 1933 by William Dudley Paley's founding of the anti-Semitic organization, the Silver Shirt Legion of America, which had a peak membership of 15,000 members in 1935. American anti-Semitism was expressed by Father Charles Coughlin, whose 1930s, 1940s weekly radio program had 5 to 12 million listeners and a newspaper with a circulation of 800,000. Both media spewed virulent anti-Semitic theories blaming Jewish bankers for the Depression, blaming Jews for the Russian Revolution and for communism, and it justified Kristallnacht as a kind of divine retribution, and they supported Hitler and Nazi Germany. The American Bund, organized in 1936, affirmed American anti-Semitism in its support for Nazi Germany. It did so not as some sort of fringe element of American society, but as an organization with 25,000 dues-paying members and 8,000 what they call stormtroopers, capable of a full public display of anti-Semitic pro-Nazi Americanism with 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden on George Washington's birthday in 1939. Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, and other public figures led anti-Semitic campaigns. The America First Committee, founded in 1940, and with 800,000 dues-paying members, among them some corporate CEOs, politicians, and civic leaders, blamed Jews for encouraging President Roosevelt for entering the war. The American right wing's anti-Semitism imagined Jewish hegemony in media and government, advocated limiting Jewish influence on American institutions and governance, and sought to limit the percentage of Jews in the American population. So it's not surprising that after the United States entered the war in December 1941, the American public and Congress, with a few notable exceptions, once again reaffirmed American anti-Semitism in refusing to rescue Jews or provide asylum for refugees from the ship, the St. Louis, which you see here on the screen. In fact, Laura Delano Hotelling, a cousin of President Roosevelt and the wife of the U.S. Commissioner of Immigration, expressed the sentiment of an anti-Semitic America at a Washington dinner party in the spring of 1939, when a State Department official asked her why she opposed the Wagner-Rogers bill to admit 20,000 German Jewish children outside of the quota system. He jotted down in his diary that she had replied, and I quote, 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow up into 20,000 ugly adults, end quote. Coughlin, Lindbergh, Ford, Hotelling, and others reflect widespread American anti-Semitism among the working class, middle, professional classes in every region of the nation, in government, social organizations, in popular culture, media caricatures, jokes, and songs, and in American colleges, white colleges and universities. In 1922, Harvard's president, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, began publicly discussing quotas for Jewish students at the same time that Harvard was also excluding Black students from campus housing. In order to limit the number of Jewish students, he reduced the significance of high academic achievement as the primary or sole criteria for admissions to Harvard. And you see some of these ideas that Harvard instituted on your screen. Harvard's new admissions criteria reduced Jewish admissions by reducing the significance and weight of academic achievement, and I quote, for serious and ambitious students of average intelligence. They gathered information on character and fitness, a very subjective criteria, required a photograph. Harvard also reduced the number of Jewish students by institutionalizing a preference for legacies. Nationwide, other institutions like Emory University in Atlanta adopted these policies. Let's look at one of those examples from Emory. In his 2019 memoir, Extracted, Unmasking Rampant Anti-Semitism in America's Higher Education, Dr. S. Perry Brickman describes how Jewish students in his 1950s dental school classes were systematically failed, with the dental school dean telling one Jewish student, and I quote, "I could flunk you or pass you, but to tell you the truth, I don't know why you Jews want to be dentists. You don't have it in your hands," end quote. While the failure rate of non-Jewish dental students in that era was 15.4%, 64.5% of Jews either failed or were required to repeat a year. If we're not sufficiently convinced of the anti-Semitism in white American higher education, this college song is quite convincing. Oh, Harvard's run by millionaires and Yale is run by booze. Cornell is run by farmers' sons. Columbia is run by Jews. So give a cheer for Baxter Street, another one for Pell. And when the little blank die, their souls will go to hell. This is from the 19-teens. With American higher education embracing and institutionalizing the same anti-Semitism as the Klan and the German American Bund and the Silver Shirts, none of us should be surprised that policies at most white American colleges and universities included not only anti-Semitic admissions policies for students, but also anti-Semitism in the hiring of Jewish faculty. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the US entering the war, the United States was challenged and embarrassed to be on the international stage fighting Nazi Germany and fascism while surrounded by these right-wing ideologues and ideologies. The entire world could see the similarities between American anti-Semitism and racism and Nazi policies. America needed to put distance between its own notions of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant inferiority and Mein Kampf. It did so tentatively, accepting only 21,000 refugees from Europe and even fewer refugees than existing quotas allowed. So the number of refugees actually declines. Frederick Cooper Heyer, in his book, The Jews and the Nation, reveals that as Jewish scholars, intellectuals, and jurists rose in prominence in the 1940s to be the first Jews in their fields and positions, in national surveys, 58% of respondents in 1945 agreed that Jews had, quote, too much power in the United States, and that Jews were seen as a greater threat to the welfare of the United States than any other national, religious, or racial group. Scholars argue about American policymakers and their rationale for these immigration restrictions and policies that ignored genocide in Nazi Germany. But the conclusions drawn in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's lessons on this topic are very clear, and these are on your screen. Number one, during the 1930s and 40s, the State Department tolerated nativist, xenophobic, and other anti-Semitic attitudes and actions before and during the war. And two, the Visa Division placed new restrictions on immigration due to national security concerns, even though it was clear that Jewish refugees in Europe were in serious danger. The earliest efforts to help exiled professors reflected this complex, mix of American anti-Semitism on one hand and American philanthropy that wanted to help on the other. In 1933, less than 2 months after the expulsion of these Jewish and liberal scholars from universities all over Germany, a committee of the Rockefeller Foundation devised a plan to prioritize which scholars would be assisted and placed according to their rank and status in order to limit the number of placements and the length of time of their contracts, and to strategically try and navigate around these Jewish quotas at white colleges and universities. With the Emergency Program Committee providing the logistics, Jewish donors funded refugee scholars' first-year salaries with matching contributions from 20 universities. Refugee scholars were also discouraged at the same time from taking any positions at HBCUs because, of course, an elite higher education system deemed these schools to be inferior. In her book, Gabrielle Simon Edgcomb repeatedly points out that from 1933 to 1941, the refugee agencies ignored Black colleges and universities. Those who found jobs at Black schools anyway in the 1930s did so only through word of mouth, through refugee networks, and the American Friends Service Committee, but not the Rockefeller Foundation. Of the 51 faculty in Edgcomb's study, only about 13 joined the faculty at Black colleges before 1941. With the Nazi annexation of Austria in March 1938 and the violence and terror of Kristallnacht in November 1938 awakened finally the Rockefeller Foundation and others to the urgency of assisting refugees. This Nazi horror was much more than a temporary emergency. The Rockefeller Foundation joined the established work of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, founded in 1914, to assist Jewish refugees. Ultimately, the joint efforts of the National Coordinating Committee included around 19 organizations, most of them Jewish, but also the American Friends Service Committee of the Society of Friends, or Quakers, and the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America, over 30 denominations. Even after 1938, the Rockefeller Foundation continued to limit the scope of its work with rigid criteria for refugee scholars to qualify for its help. Scholars had to be outstanding in their field. They had to be in their productive years. They had to have lost their position and generally be in some danger. They had to hold some promise of really improving scholarship at their American institution. And they had to give assurance of teaching in that position for at least 2 years. On June 3rd, 1940, Joseph H. Willits, the director of the Rockefeller Social Science Division, warned his colleagues not only about the enormity of overwhelming relief efforts needed, quote, if Hitler wins, but also what he saw as an opportunity to take the initiative and shop for the best. Willits assumed that the best scholars, like Albert Einstein, would be fleeing Europe, and that the foundation could sweep up, quote, 100 of the best minds from Great Britain, 75 from France, and smaller numbers from other countries, end quote. He assumed that a Nazi victory would make American universities more accepting of refugee scholars. Relief organizations then reached out to colleges and universities. For example, the American Friends Service Committee interviewed 140 college presidents, deans, registrars, heads of departments, and found sympathy for refugees, concern about budgetary limitations, but they also found anti-Semitic attitudes and schools that preferred Christian refugees. Black colleges and universities were excluded from the plan at this point to place elite scholars into elite institutions. So, for example, Hans Kelsen, philosopher and jurist, joined the Harvard Law School. Emily Noller, mathematician, went to Bryn Mawr. Nobel physicist James Frank went to Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago. And of course, Albert Einstein, already world famous with throngs of fans in the US, went to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University. Edgcomb locates what she thinks is the first outreach to Black colleges. A 1941 letter from Lawrence R. Seeley to the presidents of 6 of the most renowned private Black colleges: Fisk University in Nashville, Hampton University in Virginia, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama, Spelman College and Bennett College, both all-female institutions, Spelman in Atlanta and Bennett in Greensboro, and of course, Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. The Higher Education Act of 1965 defines historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, as any historically Black college or university that was established prior to 1964, whose principal mission was and is the education of Black Americans, and that is accredited. All but 4 were founded after the Civil War by African American and white Christian denominations: the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, more commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, also founded by African American and white private founders, by private individuals, and also founded by the Second Morrill Land Grant Act of 1890 that established land grant colleges. The HBCU private schools' core curriculum in particular reflected the liberal arts traditions of their founders and included the natural sciences, humanities, classics, and languages, especially Greek and Latin, as well as French and German, the subject areas represented by most of the refugee scholars. You should be aware that although many HBCUs were founded between the 1860s and 1880s, they did not have their first Black president until decades later. And so what I want to point out to you here is that although we're talking about HBCUs, very often we are talking about both faculty, presidents, and trustees being white. Except for colleges with Black founders, the pattern of white leadership for Black private institutions founded by white philanthropy and predominantly white denominations was in fact the norm. And so I want you to understand that Black students and faculty and the community at these institutions were accustomed to having white faculty, trustees, and administrators in their midst. But in the 1940s and 50s, the impact and challenges of these national and global events converged on Black college campuses and connected Dusseldorf, Hanover, and Leipzig to Talladega, Tougaloo, and Greensboro. The book and the film, From Swastika to Jim Crow, which I highly recommend, are based on the experiences of a few of the 41 refugee scholars from Germany and Austria who came to the United States in the 1940s and 50s and held faculty positions at 19 historically Black colleges, universities. It is a story of how oppression and resilience connect across faith and place. Of the 51 refugee scholars in Edgcomb's research and book, few stayed more than a few years, as you can see on your screen, at their Black college positions. My guess is that the post-war rapid growth in students going to college in the 1950s and the 1950s economic boom meant that many had opportunities to teach elsewhere in spite of anti-Semitism in white American higher education. There also appears to be no pattern or common characteristics among the 11 with the longest tenures of over 10 years. Most of them taught German, were also in fields such as sociology, economics, biology, art, and social work. Today, we will look briefly at those who established the longest careers at HBCUs, beginning with Frederick Leiner. Dr. Leiner, professor of French and German, who taught at West Virginia State College from 1939 to 1956, 17 years, was professor emeritus until 1961. Ernst and Marianne Maness taught at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. Professor Manassi, Ernst Manassi, taught German, Latin, and philosophy, and his wife, Marianne, taught German. And her art, such as Farm Workers on the Back of a Truck, depicts the lives of Durham's Black community. Victor Lowenfeld, one of the most influential art educators in the mid-20th century, taught at Hampton University from 1939 to 1945, first as an assistant professor of industrial arts and studio art teacher, and then later as chair of the art department. Among Lowenfeld's Hampton students were some of the most prominent Black artists of the post-war period: John Biggers, Elizabeth Catlett, and Samela Lewis. Ernst Berinsky's career is one of the most detailed stories in From Swastika to Jim Crow, both the film and the book. His story is so important, not only because of the longevity of his career, but also because of his relationship to his students and being at Tougaloo College in Mississippi for 36 years. His impact, the students themselves talk about the impact he had on their lives. The story of Jewish refugees who had long tenures at HBCUs reveals to me several experiences they held in common as follows. Number one, they were welcomed onto the Black college campus and into Black communities in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s as men and women of prestige and very high status as college professors, not because they were perceived as being Jewish or German, but because of their educational attainment and the value the Black community placed on education. Two, in spite of being welcomed, they lived on the margins of American Black, white, Southern, Christian, Protestant cultural and historical context. Three, the refugee professors were cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and urbane in ways that further marginalized them in Southern towns that tended to be insular and parochial, regardless of their size. Four, from the margins, they were nonetheless intricately involved in the lives of their students and of the Black communities where these colleges were located. They played a critical role as intellectual and spiritual guides into the post-World War classic civil rights movement, especially college student agency. Five, HBCUs, like the Black church, were both conservative spaces of Black respectability and a pathway into the Black middle class and professions, as much as they were spaces of Black activism and agency. The presence of the Jewish scholars did not redefine the space as much as it broadened the one that already existed. Six, as faculty mentors, these professors played a major role in the intellectual growth of individual students, and they supported these students' ambitions, sometimes prodding them into arenas even the students and their parents did not or could not envision in a rigidly segregated world. Seven, they all had to adjust to an American style of teaching and classroom etiquette. In all but the visual and performing arts, students' roles in Germany were to kind of listen and learn. In some, the German teaching style was highly authoritarian. Eight, they understood and witnessed the connections between their own experiences as survivors of anti-Semitism and the realities of racism, discrimination, and violence their Black students and their colleagues, their Black colleagues, experienced daily in their personal and professional lives. Nine, they were targets of right-wing xenophobia that rejected foreigners on American soil for being from another country and having an accent during the 1930s and 1960s. Some refugee faculty felt more maligned for their German than their Jewish identities. 10, those who were non-practicing Jews also had to figure out their role in the local Jewish community and its expectations that they adhere to Jewish culture, practices, beliefs, including attending temple. 11, many, if not most, had children who identified or were identified as white in school, or at least had to be culturally malleable in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multiracial world, attending all white schools, interacting with the Black campus community and church with their parents, and perhaps also going to temple. They might have had a Christmas tree and a menorah, attended compulsory chapel at the Black school on campus, and then went to temple on Saturdays. 12, HBCU alumni in their documentary film relay heartfelt stories about the ways the professors mentored them and encouraged their ambitions, often opening up new worlds of opportunity, such as a Fulbright scholarship or the application fee money for graduate school. Many of these students were still the first generation, not only to go to college, but also they were among the first generation in their families to graduate from high school. And last, the professors navigated conflicting racial spaces. They felt empathy with their Black students and community, those confrontations with racism, but they also had the option of tapping into white privilege and the inherent status that it offered. So what makes this history unique and important is how most of the HBCU campuses served as safe spaces for intellectual and personal growth and inspiration for all of the people on their campuses, Black, Jewish, white, outside of the gaze and violence and retribution of white supremacy. The story of the Jewish refugee scholars at Black colleges is part of a longer narrative of Jewish-Black relations that founders of the NAACP and Jewish activists who risked and gave their lives in the civil rights movement. But we must acknowledge that we also have inherited legacies of anti-Semitism in the Black community and anti-Black racism in the Jewish community. At an interfaith and interracial showing of the documentary film From Swastika to Jim Crow, Rabbi Robert Tobin of B'nai Shalom of West Orange, New Jersey, reminded us that this history of collaboration in the fight for social justice does not and should not erase addressing the ways we all continue to perpetuate stereotypes, racism, and prejudice in our own lives. This episode in our mutual history should reveal the potential to transform the world and transform each other's world by affirming all of humanity. Today, my goal has been to offer you a glimpse of the strong alliances between the survivors of European anti-Semitism and American racism. I also hope these stories illuminate the serious challenges to collaboration and fighting internal and external demons of racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. Edgcomb's work does not show us that it is easier to love than to hate, to embrace than to reject, to learn rather than dismiss. Rather, she shows us how extraordinary and rare it is to enter foreign space and find that instead of losing ourselves, we find newer and better selves. What can our students learn from this episode of European and American history? I'll offer here for you just a few examples for you to consider. For pre-K to fifth grade, focusing on, of course, teaching students social skills and social science content. Think about ways we help young children understand their own feelings and the feelings of others, to understand empathy, which is even hard for adults to grasp. We can teach about the essence of all kinds of immigration, people who go to a new place or meet new people in any context. We can teach about collaboration and coalitions, people of different backgrounds and identities working together. We can teach thematic lessons that combine the Holocaust, Japanese internment, Black enslavement, Indigenous peoples' removal from their homelands, never, ever with a sense of comparing dehumanization, but rather illuminating that the entire human family is capable both of great horrors to each other, but also great resilience and an ability to care about each other. We can teach children about people then helping and rescuing others as an act of humanity. For middle and high school students, we can excite them with the unexpected, such as teaching them about, as part of the progressive era, talking about the NAACP's Jewish founders, as well as the Black founders, talking about Jack Greenberg and the work he brought to civil rights cases as head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. We can talk about contemporary events that illuminate an historical lesson. Right now in front of us, we have censorship of books being pulled out of school libraries. We can talk about racial and ethnic discrimination in the present as well as in the past. One of the things I love about the creativity of all of you as teachers, that you can zoom in with biographies and autobiographies, looking at specific people to illuminate a history, as well as zooming out and looking at broader thematic areas. And then finally, I encourage you to be interdisciplinary and use a variety of sources from literature, history, popular culture, and visual and performing arts throughout your curriculum to enrich our students' experiences and to understand that all topics illuminate the human condition and illuminate human possibilities. Thank you very much. And I look forward to a discussion.